I wasn't in a good place that fall, and that's the plainest way I know to say it without dressing it up. I was 54, hands always split at the knuckles from diesel work and cold weather, living alone in my late father's homestead at the edge of timber country where the county road narrowed down to gravel and then to mud. 18 months earlier, I'd buried my wife, Ellen, after a quiet cancer that took her in inches. I still reached for her side of the sink some mornings, still set out 2 mugs by mistake now and then, and still put one right back in the cabinet like I was correcting a shop invoice. Around the same season, my son Levi and I did what men do when neither one of us has the right language for pain. We started talking only about practical things, then less than that, then not at all, unless one of us needed a part number or a weather check. By October, silence had become my main skill. The house itself wasn't much to look at, but it was honest. Pine floors my father had milled himself. A porch that leaned a little east, where frost had heaved one corner for years. A wood stove that worked better if you hit the side plate once with a boot heel before lighting it, because the draft gate stuck unless reminded. I liked that kind of logic. If you knew what was broken, you knew what to do with your hands. My own thinking had always been built that way. Torque specs, compression readings, feed bills, oil weight by temperature, bolt patterns, and the sound of a bad bearing before it failed. Those were my scriptures. I never gave much time to stories people told after dark when they'd had 2 beers, and wanted the woods to mean more than trees. I figured if a thing was real, it left marks you could measure. Pre-dawn was the hardest part of every day. I'd wake before light because the house had grown too quiet to sleep through, pull on wool socks stiff from drying near the stove, and make coffee in an old enamel pot with a chipped blue rim. The radio on the counter hadn't worked since spring lightning took it out. I never fixed it. I told myself I liked the silence, but that wasn't exactly true. I sat with that dead radio hissing faintly with no station to catch and watched the black window turn from mirror to glass, while frost drew fern patterns along the corners. Some mornings I tried to remember Ellen's cough from those last months and could only remember the way she'd tapped the spoon twice against her mug, neat and gentle, so it didn't ring loud enough to wake me if I had finally slept. Grief doesn't always hit like thunder. Sometimes it's that spoon over and over. After coffee, I'd pull on coveralls and go out to the barn. The cold lived in that building even at noon. Mabel, my one remaining milk cow, would turn her head when she heard the latch and breathe steam into the beam of my flashlight, patient as a church elder. She was old, left hip a little stiff, right ear nicked from a winter branch years back, and she gave less milk each season. I kept her anyway, maybe because my father had raised her line, maybe because feeding one living thing that depended on me felt like a sentence I could still complete. I'd fork hay, check water, run a hand along the fence boards for loose nails, and listen to the soft sounds of an animal that had no interest in my history and no opinion about whether I was handling it well. By mid-morning, I usually worked whatever the place demanded, and in late fall, it demanded plenty. One day it was re-hanging the lower pasture gate where freeze-thaw had lifted the post. Next day it was patching shingles over the mudroom after a wind peeled 3 of them back like fish scales. Then sleet came in, needling sideways across the fields, and I spent 4 hours mending fence with gloves too wet to feel wire ends. My father used to say, fence work teaches you how stubborn your body is. He was right. You bend, pull, twist, staple, stand, and do it again while the weather tells you to quit. I liked work that made a clean argument. This line is broken. Now it isn't. Emotional life never gave me that. By the second week of November, the roads had turned brittle at dawn and greasy by noon, and I'd gone 3 full days without hearing my own voice. I noticed it when I dropped a wrench and expected myself to mutter something, but nothing came out. That got my attention in a way I didn't enjoy. Not because silence was new, but because it had stopped feeling temporary. I was becoming the kind of man who moved through rooms without sound, who stacked wood by height and species, who ate standing up, who could spend an afternoon repacking wheel bearings and call that a complete day. If you'd asked me then whether I was lonely, I'd have said no. I had chores, I had weather to track, I had diesel filters to soak, I had a roofline to watch for ice. What I did not have, and what I could not admit yet, was any sense that my life reached beyond the next task. The property line on the north side was marked by an old white oak that had outlived 3 barns, 2 marriages, and more winters than I could guess. Its trunk took both my arms and then some. Lightning had scarred one side in a long, pale seam, and still it leafed full each spring. My father used to stand there with a thermos on cold evenings and tell me, "That's where the woods start listening." I used to roll my eyes and ask if the woods were planning to answer. He'd grin and say, "Not to men who only ask smart questions." Back then, I thought he was being poetic to cover for not knowing something. Now, with him gone and Ellen gone and Levi far enough away to feel like another weather system, I found myself standing by that oak at dusk more nights than not, boots sunk in leaf mould, hands in my jacket pockets, looking into the first line of timber like there might be a tool hanging there I'd forgotten. I did call Levi sometimes, or I dialed and stared at his name and set the phone down before it rang. The one time I got through that month, we talked 7 minutes, and most of it was logistics. "You get that transfer case sorted out?" he asked. "Yeah, needed a seal kit and new fluid." "Good. You still at the Portman shop?" "Most days." A pause sat between us, not hostile, just tired. "Cold up there?" he said. "Couple degrees below in the morning." I wanted to tell him I missed the way he used to come in the door and throw his keys on the same hook no matter how many times his mother asked him not to. I wanted to tell him I'd mistaken numbness for strength and called it being practical, because practical sounded respectable. I asked instead, "You got decent tires on that truck?" "Dad," he said, and his voice softened, almost a laugh, almost a warning. "I'm fine." We said goodbye like co-workers ending a shift. The only regular conversation I had in person was with Milt Hanrahan from 2 properties over, and even that was sparse. He was 60-something, all denim and tobacco tin, and he checked his mailbox on an old 4-wheeler that sounded like loose bolts in a dryer. If he caught me by the road, we'd trade updates about culverts and feed prices, and whether county ploughs were running late again. One grey afternoon, sleet ticking on his jacket shoulders, he looked past me toward my north field and said, "You settling in all right up there, Roy?" "Settling as much as a man can," I said. He nodded once. "Winter gets long when a place starts talking back." I snorted. "If this place talks, it's asking for new wiring." Milt smiled at that. Small and crooked. "Could be." Then he tipped 2 fingers and rattled off down the road, leaving me with his exhaust hanging low in the cold like a sentence he hadn't finished. Nights were the worst because chores were done and the house still expected company. I'd sit at the kitchen table with ledger paper and write numbers I already knew. Propane left, hay bales left, diesel in the tank, days till I'd need to run to town. Sometimes I ran my thumb over Ellen's wedding band where it hung on a nail by the sink. I couldn't wear it and I couldn't put it away. I kept telling myself I'd make things right with Levi when the timing was better, when roads were safer, when work slowed down, when I felt less raw, when I had the correct words lined up. That's the trick grief plays if you let it run the shop. It keeps inventing tomorrow so you don't have to face today. Toward the end of that month, a hard stillness settled in around dusk each evening. the kind that made even the creek sound farther off than usual. I noticed details more because there was so little else moving. Frost lifting in thin white breath from manure piles, the sweet sour smell of silage in the barn aisle, the hinge complaint on the back gate when temperature dropped below 20, crows changing roost trees when wind shifted north. I told myself this was what recovery looked like, paying attention to ordinary things again. Maybe that was partly true. But underneath that tidy explanation, another truth kept knocking around in me. I had come out here to be left alone, and I was learning there's a difference between solitude and absence. One gives you room, the other takes your shape. Most evenings I ended where I started, on the porch steps facing the old oak. From there I could see the flat stone at its roots, half sunk in moss, and the split-rail fence running away from it like a rough pencil line into dusk. I'd hold a cooling mug in both hands and listen to nothing much at all. Wind in dry grass, Mabel shifting in the barn, one late bird cutting across the field. I never said my father's line out loud, but I heard it anyway. The place where the woods start listening. I didn't think anything was out there waiting on me. I didn't think the world had tucked away some hidden kindness for a man who'd spent a year and a half avoiding his own son and pretending sorrow was just another maintenance task. I thought winter was coming, and I thought I would endure it, same as always, one repaired thing at a time. That was the whole of what I believed then. It was not much, but it was enough to get me to morning. One evening just before full dark, the field went hush, quiet. Late birds cut off, squirrels in the oak gone still. Jasper stood by the old oak, calm, tail low and wagging once or twice. He didn't come closer. On the flat stone at the roots sat a neat bundle of dry kindling tied with baling twine, with 2 apples beside it. I looked at him, then heard myself mutter, "Thank you," and felt embarrassed clear to my ears. Jasper glanced back at me like he was waiting for further instructions, and all I had was a hot face and a coffee mug, gone cold in my hands. I stood there on the porch step, looking from the dog to the stone and back again, trying to assemble a sensible explanation that did not involve me thanking a pile of twigs, like a man who'd spent too long alone. The bundle was real enough. Dry cedar splints, finger-thick, ends cleanly snapped, tied with red baling twine I didn't use on this place. The apples were small and yellow-red, late fruit with a few leaf nicks, set side by side as careful as offerings at a church rail. Nothing about it looked tossed or dropped. It looked placed. I hated how much that distinction mattered the second I noticed it. I set my mug on the top porch board and walked down slow, boots pressing wet leaves into the mud. Jasper moved with me, shoulder near my leg, not tense, not alert in any way I recognized from coyotes or strangers. His tail kept that low, patient sweep, once, twice, then still. He sat when I stopped at the old oak and looked past it into timber dark that had already swallowed shape and distance. If there was anybody watching, I couldn't see them. No flashlight shine, no shifting branch line, just trunks standing black and the smell of damp bark and cold dirt. "Did you drag this here?" I asked Jasper, because speech felt necessary, and because he was the one creature in reach. He looked at me, blinked, then faced the woods again. I crouched by the stone. The kindling was dry all the way through, not just dry on top. Whoever put it there knew enough to keep it under cover a while before setting it out. I picked up one stick and held it to my nose. Cedar and clean sap. No fuel smell, no shop smell, no rot. The apples were firm and colder than my knuckles. I rolled one in my palm and checked for teeth marks like maybe a deer had mouthed it and dropped it. Nothing. I set it back exactly where it had been because moving it felt rude in a way I could not justify. By full dark, I'd carried the bundle to the porch and left the apples on the kitchen counter under the dead radio, where they looked brighter than anything else in that room. I built a small fire with 2 of those sticks, and they caught so fast it almost startled me. Dry kindling in November mattered around here. It was practical help, not mystery. Practical help can come from neighbors. Practical help can come from folks who don't like being thanked. I held on to that thought so tightly. My jaw ached. Still, I checked the lane with a flashlight before bed. I checked the north fence line. I checked around the oak itself with the beam low across the ground, like I was searching for dropped hardware in a shop bay. The soil near the stone was a mix of root rise and old leaf mat, not good for prints. I found mine from earlier, Jasper's, and plenty of squirrel tracks from before the hush settled in. No fresh boot tread I could identify. No tire marks off the lane. No candy wrappers. No beer cans. No sign of teenagers making a joke of an old man with 1 cow and too much quiet. Inside, the house held cold at shoulder height and stove heat at knee level, that awkward in-between it always had after sundown. I fried 2 eggs, ate 1, and let the other sit untouched beside a heel of bread. Ellen used to tell me I cooked like a man preparing for weather, not hunger. She was right about that too. I washed the plate, dried my hands on the same dish towel she'd bought 10 years earlier, and stood by the sink staring at the apples until the clock above the pantry clicked past 9. My phone buzzed on the windowsill then, Levi's name lighting the cracked screen. I got there too late and caught voicemail instead. Road noise, a turn signal ticking, and his voice saying, "Just checking if the pump froze. Call when you can." I typed out, "We're fine, pump's fine." Roads are slick, and stared at it until the screen dimmed, then deleted it and set the phone face down. I told myself this couldn't be real, in the way my father used to suggest. Woods listening and all that. I told myself it was probably Milt or someone from church who'd heard I was out here and figured I needed a nudge. I told myself I'd ask around and settle it by noon tomorrow. Then the other thought came in quiet and unwelcome. If it was somebody trying to be kind, why did I feel like crying every time I looked at those apples? I slept badly and woke often, the old house creaking in frost. At one point I sat up, sure I'd heard a footstep on the porch, only to realize it was an icicle dropping from the gutter and shattering on the rail. When morning finally pushed a grey stripe across the bedroom wall, I got up heavy and sore and pulled the curtain aside. The oak stood where it always stood. Jasper was already at the back door waiting, ears up but relaxed. I noticed then I'd left 1 apple on the counter and eaten the other sometime near midnight, without deciding to. Core sat in the sink, clean down to seed. By the 3rd morning after that first bundle, the cold had settled hard enough to make the pump handle sting through gloves, and the loneliness in me had turned from ache to habit again. I fed Mabel, forked manure, checked the roof braces in the barn, and worked my way through chores with that steady mechanical rhythm that lets a man avoid his own head. The sky stayed low and white all day. Sound carried strangely across the field, then dropped out altogether once dusk leaned in. No crows, no chickadees at the feeder. Even the creek seemed padded over. Jasper finished his kibble, lifted his head, and walked straight to the old oak as if he'd been called by name. I followed with a scoop of cracked corn still in my hand. Halfway across the yard I stopped, because that hush from the other night had returned, only deeper. Not empty, intent. The hair on my arms rose under wool, not from fear exactly, more from the sense of stepping into a room where someone had already been waiting a long time. Jasper stood at the line where my grass ended and leaf litter began. He did not bark, he did not growl. He lowered himself to his elbows and then fully down, chin on paws, tail tapping once against the ground like a polite knock. On the flat stone sat 3 things this time: another tight bundle of dry kindling, 2 crossed river stones dark with moisture, and a strip of peeled willow bark braided into a ring big enough to slip over my wrist. The weave was simple, but deliberate, over, under, over, tucked clean at both ends. I knew willow from fence repair and basket patches. This wasn't random breakage twisted by wind. It was made. I stood there so long my fingertips went numb. Every practical habit I had started spinning up at once. Could Milt be doing this? And walking in through timber so I wouldn't catch him on the lane? Possible, but Milt's left knee clicked loud enough to hear from 10 feet when it was cold. Could kids be sneaking around after dark? Maybe, but no boot prints, no track churn, and kids don't usually bring dry cedar and braided bark like they're trying to keep a man's stove lit. Could I be missing obvious evidence because I wanted this to mean something? That question landed hardest because I knew grief could bend perception. It can take ordinary weather and make it feel like a message. It can take a kindness and make it look like rescue. "Whoever you are," I said to the trees, voice rough from disuse, "you don't have to do this." No answer came, not in words, not in any storybook way. A little pressure moved through branches farther back. One slow sweep as if a heavy shoulder had leaned past cedar boughs. Jasper lifted his head, watched that patch of shadow, and thumped his tail twice against the ground. Then he settled again. I laughed once, short and bewildered. "Great," I said. "My dog trusts the woods better than I trust people." It came out halfway between a joke and a confession, and for the first time in weeks, I heard my own voice with some life in it. I picked up the bark ring and turned it over in my hands. Damp, cool, faint green smell. No cuts, no snags, no sign of metal tools. I set the crossed stones back exactly as they were after checking under them for notes, because that seemed like something a sane man would do when his life stopped making straight lines. The kindling I carried to the porch in 2 trips. Each stick was trimmed to stove length, close enough to mine that whoever did it had either measured my firebox or guessed with uncommon luck. That evening, I lit the stove with one of those cedar pieces and sat on the floor beside Jasper, back against the couch Ellen had wanted to replace for 12 years, and never did. The house smelled of wood smoke and dog fur and old pine boards warming up. My chest hurt in that familiar bruised place grief had kept raw, but there was another feeling braided through it now, thin and steady as twine. Attention. I was paying attention again, not just to tasks, but to presence, to pattern, to the way kindness can arrive without asking permission. 3 days passed before I admitted out loud that I was waiting for dusk. I kept my routine the same on purpose. Fed Mabel, checked panels, split what little dry maple I had left under tarp, scraped the mud from my boots on the same bent scraper nail by the door. I did not camp at the oak like a fool with a camera. I did not set traps or put up motion lights. By late afternoon I brewed coffee and stood on the porch, and Jasper stood with me, both of us facing north like men at a train platform, pretending we weren't expecting anyone. The field took on that blue hour colour where edges blur and distances flatten. Birds quieted by degrees, first the loud ones, then all of them. Squirrels that had been busy on the fence rails vanished into den holes. The hush settled. Jasper stepped down into the yard and sat. I noticed then that my hands had stopped shaking, though the temperature had dropped below freezing. My breathing was deeper than it had been in months. And, with no small amount of shame, I recognized that part of me hoped for one more sign, not because I needed proof for anybody else, but because the signs had made me feel less discarded by my own life. That realization stung. It also cleared something. At the base of the old oak, where the flat stone caught the last thin light, lay a single smooth river rock with a white vein running through it like a bolt of milk glass. Beside it sat a spray of late wild aster, stems wrapped in grass, blooms still mostly purple despite the cold. Jasper went to the stone, sniffed once, and lay down beside it like a guard posted at a small, sacred thing. I stayed where I was, one hand on the porch rail, and nodded toward the woods the way my father used to nod toward strangers at the feed store. "Thank you," I said again, less embarrassed this time, and the word held. A little while after I said it, a breeze came down the timber and lifted the aster heads once, then let them settle. That was all. No shape stepping out, no dramatic sign. Just cold thickening in the yard and Jasper staying put by the stone like he'd been given a job. I stood there until my toes went numb, then climbed back to the porch and watched the old oak darken into a single black pillar against the tree line. I tried to turn it into a neighborly explanation again. Somebody from up county cutting through on foot. Somebody who knew I was alone and didn't want to embarrass me by knocking. Somebody with steady hands, a kind streak, and an odd schedule. Every version worked for about 10 seconds, then fell apart on details. Nobody crossed that much muddy ground without leaving sign. Nobody hauled dry cedar in after rain unless they'd stashed it somewhere covered. Nobody braided willow that clean unless they'd done it a lot. I had spent half my life finding faults in engines by listening for what did not fit. The same ear was working now whether I liked it or not. I went down with a flashlight before full dark and checked the base of the oak, sweeping low over roots and leaf litter. I found Jasper's prints, my own, and one deer track angled along the fence. Nothing else clear. The soil there was a poor witness, all old leaves and ridged roots, but I kept checking anyway, circling wider each pass, stopping to kneel and touch mud where the beam caught a depression that might have been something and might not. The beam shook a little from my hand, not from fear, just cold and too much coffee. By the time I came back in, my knees were wet and my shoulders ached. I lined the river rock on the windowsill, set the asters in a jelly jar, and hated how careful I was being, like I could protect a moment by putting it in order. Sleep came in scraps. At some point near dawn, I gave up and started coffee, then took it back to the table with my old ledger book. Instead of feed numbers, I wrote 3 columns. Possible source, evidence for, evidence against. It looked ridiculous, and it also calmed me. Under possible source, I wrote Milt, kids, Hunter, me forgetting things, and left a line blank I didn't name. Under evidence for Milt, lives close, knows woods, practical man. Evidence against bad knee, no matching twine, wouldn't leave flowers. Kids for mischief age, can move quiet. Against no rappers, no noise, too patient. Hunter for tracks game trail. Against why help my fence line and stove wood. Me forgetting things for grief fog, poor sleep. Against I know my own cedar stack and I know baling twine colours. I stared at that page until coffee cooled and finally laughed at myself, low and tired. Roy Murray, I said to the dead radio, you made a diagnostic chart for kindness. By midday, the sky had gone pewter and spitting sleet. So I walked the north line while there was still light. I checked each post and panel, more to think than because it needed it. Near the lower bend, where runoff chewed at the corner every spring, I found the first new thing that day. 2 stones set in a clean cross on top of the fence rail, balanced neat despite wind. Not random, not dropped. Set. I picked them up, felt their wet weight and put them back exactly where they'd been. 30 steps farther, at a weak gap I'd patched sloppy last week with old wire, I stopped again. 2 slim, peeled saplings had been woven through the rails and tied off to brace the opening. Done with the kind of practical sense my father liked. Simple, strong, no waste. Not my work, too fresh for old. Tight enough that Mabel couldn't nose through, even if she tried. I stood there a long minute with sleet tapping my cap brim, looking at that repair and feeling a strange mix of gratitude and stubbornness rise in me. I drove the 4-wheeler down to the county box road at mail time and caught Milt at his mailbox. Cap pulled low, cigarette tucked behind one ear, unlit against the weather. He looked at my face once and leaned back against his rack without asking why I'd come. "You got a minute?" I said. "Got 2 if the sleet keeps polite." I told him about the kindling, the apples, the stones, the fence brace. Not fast, not dramatic, just facts laid out like parts on a bench. He listened without the usual half-smile people use when they think you're spinning up a lonely man's story. When I finished, he spat into the ditch, rubbed his jaw, and looked past me toward my place. "I ain't saying what it is, Roy," he said, voice even. "Just saying that line of your woods has always had company." "What kind of company?" He shrugged inside his coat. "The kind that keeps to itself unless weather turns ugly. My granddad used to leave salt on a flat rock come first freeze. Said it was manners." I gave him a look. Milt held up one hand. "You asked," I answered. "You want practical? Here's practical. Nobody's cutting your fence, nobody's stealing feed, and whatever's out there hasn't done a mean thing yet. Don't chase it. Don't corner it. Keep your dog close after dark. That's all I know." That doesn't help much. It helps exactly enough. On the ride back, sleet turned to fine snow that melted on my jacket and soaked through by the shoulders. Milt's words sat with me, not as proof, just as a frame I hadn't considered. Company. The term sounded less like folklore and more like neighbor etiquette from an older rulebook. I parked, fed Mabel, and checked the new sapling brace again with my hand on it, testing the spring. Good work, better than mine had been. I felt ridiculous for being offended by that, and grateful at the same time. By that Sunday, I had started checking the oak line first thing at dawn and last thing before bed, same as I checked Mabel's water and the stove draft. I kept pretending it was about property security. That story satisfied the part of me that still needed every choice to pass inspection. The truth was simpler and harder. The checks gave shape to my day, and shape kept grief from flooding all the unguarded corners. That evening I carried a thermos cap with a pinch of salt and a small scoop of cracked corn, walked to the flat stone, and set it down feeling foolish and oddly formal. Jasper stood beside me and leaned his weight against my knee for a second. "If this is bad manners," I told him, "you can blame Milt." I left it there and walked back without looking over my shoulder, though every muscle in my neck wanted to. On the porch, I sat with my coat zipped to my chin and watched the dark settle in layers. A barred owl called once from deep timber. Then quiet again. Not empty. Waiting. I told myself this couldn't be real in the storybook sense, and I meant it. I wasn't converting overnight into a man who saw signs in every shadow, but I also couldn't deny the pattern that kept repeating: gifts at the boundary, repairs where weather made trouble, no approach to the house, no harm to stock, no harm to dog, no push for attention. Whatever this was, it behaved with more restraint than most men I'd known. 2 days later, just before Blue Hour, I hauled a feed bucket from the shed toward Mabel's pen. The sky was that pale iron colour where snow and dusk mix, and the split-rail fence ran dark against the field like pencil marks. Jasper trotted ahead, then slowed near the old oak and looked north without sound. I kept walking 3 steps and stopped because my body had already registered what my mind had not. There was a shape by the oak that did not belong to trunk or shadow. He stood on the far side of the property line, half-turned, one hand on a fallen fence post like it weighed no more than a shovel handle. Tall is too small a word for it. Beside that oak and rail he rose 8 feet at least, maybe more, shoulders broad enough to block the pale light behind him. Dark fur, matted in places from weather, moved slightly at the edges in wind. He did not loom. He did not square up. He was simply there, steady and unhurried, as if he had been there a long while and saw no need to hide now that he'd been seen. My first clear thought was measurement. Fence rail to top rail, known height. Oak scar line at about 6 feet, where I'd marked once with Levi's old pocket knife. The head above that, by plenty. My second thought was absurd and immediate. He's setting that post straight. Because he was. One huge hand held the post upright while the other pressed soil at its base with careful pushes, not pounding, not tearing ground, just firming it until it stood. The motion was deliberate, the way a good mechanic seats a gasket. Enough force, no waste. I froze with the bucket hanging from my right hand, grain shifting softly inside. Jasper moved past me at an easy trot, stopped 10 yards short of the oak, and sat. No bark, no raised hackles. Tail low, one slow wag. A pair of deer at the far edge of the pasture lifted their heads, watched, then went back to grazing. That landed harder than anything. Deer do not graze through danger. I wanted to run to the house and lock a door I knew was mostly symbolic. I wanted to stand where I was until dark swallowed us both. I wanted to call somebody and have a second set of eyes right then. Instead, I stood in my boots in the damp cold, breathing steam, and listened. No roar, no crashing theatrics, just branch pressure as weight shifted, the faint scrape of wood against packed soil, and one slow exhale that clouded white in front of his face. He finished with the post, released it, and watched it hold. Then, with a movement that told me more than size ever could, he stepped backward. Not toward me, back from the line. One pace, then another, careful to keep distance, hands open at his sides. He angled his body so he was less square to me, the way people do with skittish horses. I had worked around enough animals to read that for what it was, an effort not to crowd. My knees felt weak all at once. I set the bucket down slow so I wouldn't spill and put both hands on my thighs, not because I was about to bolt, but because my body had to put the shock somewhere. "Okay," I heard myself say, voice thin in the cold. "Okay." I was talking to him, to Jasper, to my own pounding chest. I couldn't have said. He stayed still. Amber-brown eyes caught what little light was left and held it without glare, without challenge. There was age in that face, and caution, and something else I'm still careful naming because words can cheapen it. Regard, maybe. The kind that notices you as a living thing and makes room. We stayed like that for what could have been 20 seconds or 5 minutes. Time loosened around the edges. Snow started in tiny dry grains that clicked softly on my jacket. Jasper lowered himself to the ground and laid his chin on his paws, facing that big dark figure like he was sharing a porch with an old friend. I almost laughed then, half from disbelief and half from the plain awkwardness of it. "I actually said okay to a 9-foot stranger," I muttered, and the sound of my own voice steadied me. He gave one small tilt of the head, then turned sideways, and moved back through the first line of timber. Not fast, not dramatic. Careful foot placement, each step choosing quiet ground. Branches flexed and settled. Dark folded into dark. And then he was gone, leaving the post standing straight and the field exactly where I'd always known it, only not the same anymore. I didn't chase. I didn't call out. I walked to the oak on legs that still felt borrowed and put my hand on the repaired post. Solid. Fresh set. I looked at the soil and found impressions deeper than mine, broad and long, edges softened by leaf mold, but there if you knew how to read pressure and weight. I did not measure them yet. I just looked, then looked up at the timber where he had stepped back instead of forward. In the failing light, with Jasper pressed warm against my calf, curiosity was no longer a distraction from grief. It was the first clean breath I'd taken in a long time. I stayed there with my palm on that post until the cold worked through my glove and into my fingers, as if numbness could slow down what I had just seen. Jasper leaned his shoulder into my leg and let out a long breath that fogged in front of us both. I looked once more into the timber and saw nothing except trunks and dark gaps where evening gathered early. Then I crouched and studied the impressions in the leaf mold. They were not sharp prints, not the kind a game warden photographs with a ruler and bags as evidence, but the pressure pattern was clear enough to my eye. Deep heel set, long forefoot, weight carried evenly. Not a stumbling stride, not a rush. He had moved like a man carrying a full pail he did not want to spill. I walked back to the barn, fed Mabel, and spilled half a scoop of grain because my hand would not steady. She nudged my elbow with her rough nose, patient and damp, and went on chewing like I was the one having a strange day, not her. In the house, I lit the stove, then sat at the table without taking my coat off and wrote down what I had seen in my ledger, line by line, same way I used to record injector timing when I wanted no argument later. Time, light, distance from porch to oak, height against known fence rail, behavior observed. I made myself write, stepped backward twice after noticing me, and underlined it once. I wrote, repaired post with care. I wrote, dog calm. The last line I stared at for a long minute before putting it on paper anyway. No sign of aggression. None. That night I dreamed of Ellen standing at the sink with her back to me. Not sick, just standing there in her old green sweater, turning an apple in her hand. I woke before dawn with wet eyes and a stiff neck. And for the first time in months, I did not try to shove the feeling back down like loose wiring into a crowded junction box. I sat up, feet on cold floorboards, and let grief and wonder share the same room without deciding which one had a right to be there. By Tuesday morning, the sky had cleared into a hard, bright blue that made every fence staple and twig edge look sharp enough to cut. I took a tape measure, a carpenter's square, and my phone to the oak line after chores. Part of me still needed numbers. Numbers had carried me through breakdowns before. At the base of the oak, I found 3 deeper impressions than the rest, preserved where roots held moisture. I measured length against my own boot sole and stopped halfway through writing it down because my pulse was beating in my throat. I took 2 photos, one wide, one close, then slipped the phone back into my pocket like I had caught myself doing something private. I heard Milt's four-wheeler around noon and flagged him by the road. He killed the engine, listened to me in that same quiet way, then asked to see the line. We walked together, Jasper pacing between us, and when Milt saw the repaired post and the pressure marks near the oak, he did not whistle, did not joke, did not act impressed for sport. He just squatted, set 2 knuckles into one of the impressions, and nodded once. "You keeping these pictures?" he asked. "Yeah." "Good. Keep them to yourself a bit." "You think I'm seeing what I think I'm seeing?" Milt stood up slow, hand on his knee. "I think you're seeing what you saw. That's enough. Folks get loud about things they don't understand, and loud ruins delicate arrangements." He looked toward the timber and added, "If he's holding that line, you hold it too. Respect goes both directions." I almost laughed at how absurd and reasonable that sounded at the same time. I am getting etiquette advice about a giant neighbor from a man who once welded his mailbox shut by accident. That was one time, he said, and a corner of his mouth lifted. And the mail stayed dry. When he left, I went back to work on the south shed door hinges, then replaced 2 cracked insulators on the barn circuit, where sleet had worn them thin. I kept catching myself pausing with tools in my hand, listening toward the north field even in full daylight, as if attention had become a second pulse running under the day's noise. Near dusk, I took the thermos cap again, this time with salt, cracked corn, and 1 peeled carrot from my own kitchen, and set it on the flat stone with both hands. I said nothing. Words felt smaller than what was happening. He did not show himself that evening. Neither did he show the next. Signs still came. On Wednesday morning, the cap was empty and clean, set upright near the aster jar I had left on the stone after the blooms browned. On Thursday, after a night of freezing rain, I found a fresh cross of river stones on the top rail by the north bend, and a wind-thrown branch cut and dragged clear of the lane before I was even out with my saw. Not hacked, not shredded, shifted with intent. I stood there with sleet melting down my collar and felt my skepticism change shape, not vanish. It stopped being denial and became stewardship. I still questioned every detail. I simply stopped forcing the answer backward into something smaller than what my own eyes kept giving me. Levi called that Thursday after dark. I almost let it ring out, then answered on the second pass. "You breathing over there?" he said. "Yeah, sorry. Long day." Pump froze. "Not yet." A pause, then, "You sound different." I looked through the kitchen window toward the old oak, now just a broad silhouette against low cloud. Something's been helping around here. With chores, with fences, kindling, things like that. He was quiet long enough that I heard him shift the phone. "Dad, you got somebody staying there?" "No." "You hiring help?" "No." Another pause. "Then what are you saying?" I sat down at the table and rubbed my forehead with my thumb. "I'm saying I saw him by the oak 2 nights ago. Tall as the fence is high and then some. He fixed a post and stepped back when he saw me. Jasper sat down like it was normal. Deer kept grazing." Levi exhaled hard, not angry, more unsettled. "You hit your head?" "No." "You taking your meds?" "I'm taking blood pressure pills, same as always. I'm sleeping enough to know what I saw." Silence again, but thinner now. He did not hang up. He said quieter, "You don't sound spun out. You sound awake." "I think I am." "All right," he said finally. "I don't know what to do with that, but I hear you." That sentence hit me square in the chest. Not belief, not dismissal, just room. "That's enough for tonight," I said. After we hung up, I sat with Jasper on the floor by the stove and watched orange light move over the boards. I told myself I was still a man who trusted evidence, still a man who knew grief can bend a person toward stories. I also told myself this: if wonder keeps showing up in the same place with the same restraint, and if it never asks for worship, only respect, maybe that is evidence too. The next afternoon brought the kindness I could not argue away with any tidy theory. A wet wind came down from the ridge and turned the north side of the pasture to grey paste. I was carrying a pail of grain to Mabel when I heard her bellow from beyond the old oak, not her usual complaint, sharper and breathy. I dropped the pail and ran. She had pushed through a weak section near the boundary where frost heave had lifted a lower rail, then stepped into a tangle of old barbed wire buried under leaves from years back. One loop had cinched around her rear leg just above the hoof. Every time she pulled, it bit tighter and dragged another strand around the stump of a dead sapling. She was not down, but she was scared. Eyes rolled white, sides heaving steam. "Easy, girl, easy," I said, hands up, trying to get to her flank without spooking her into a harder pull. I grabbed the wire with gloves and felt it sing tight under strain. No give. I backed off, scanned for cutters, swore at myself for leaving them in the barn, and took one step to run when movement at the timber edge caught my eye. He was there just beyond the line, half in cedar shadow, watching Mabel and me with that same steady regard. For one blink, I stood frozen between panic and disbelief. Then he moved, not toward us, but along the woods, side parallel to the fence, until he reached the dead sapling anchoring the snare tangle. He crouched, wrapped one hand around the buried root mass, and rocked it once, testing. Mabel jerked, wire tightened, and I shouted, "Hold, hold, hold," though I had no right to command either of them. He braced and pulled. Soil lifted in a dark clump, roots tearing free with a wet rip, and the whole anchor shifted 6 inches toward him. That slack was all I needed. I dove in, got both gloved hands around the loop at Mabel's leg, twisted it hard against itself, and slipped it down over her hoof. She lurched forward, stumbled once, then cleared free of the remaining tangle and bolted uphill toward the barn lot, tail high, limping but moving. I knelt in mud with wire in my hands, breathing like I had run miles. On the far side of the line, he set the root mass down gentle, not tossing it, and looked at me. Rain beaded on his fur. His chest rose and fell slowly. No strain display, no claim. He had done exactly what was needed and no extra. Deliberate, unmistakable, aimed at the one animal on this place that still tethered me to daily care. "Thank you," I said, louder this time, voice shaking. "For her." He tilted his head once, then reached down and lifted the remaining wire coil with 2 fingers, careful not to snag it on brush, and laid it on the flat stone by the oak, where I would see it and remove it for good. The gesture was so practical it nearly undid me. Not mystery for mystery's sake, just help, finish clean. I laughed and choked on it at once. Mud on my knees, rain on my face. "I am kneeling in a pasture talking manners with a giant stranger," I said to nobody and everybody. Ellen would have told me to use better words. He stayed for 3 breaths more, then stepped backward into the timber. Same measured retreat, same refusal to crowd. Branches swayed and settled. He was gone. I sat there until the rain thinned to mist, then stood, gathered every inch of that old barbed wire, and carried it to the shed. I coiled it tight, tagged it with orange tape, and hung it high where it could never catch hoof again. At the barn, Mabel had calmed, standing with one hind leg cocked. The skin was rubbed but unbroken. I cleaned her down, checked for swelling, and leaned my forehead against her shoulder while she chewed hay and breathed warm against my sleeve. When full dark came, I walked back to the oak with a fresh bundle of dry cedar from my stack and set it on the stone beside the wire coil he had left. The woods were quiet, not empty, and for the first time since Ellen died, I felt the quiet hold me instead of hollow me. I stood there a while longer with my empty hands hanging at my sides, looking at that cedar bundle on the stone like it was a receipt for a debt I could never settle. Rain had gone to mist, and mist had gone to a fine, hard cold that found the seams in my jacket. Jasper sat beside me with his ears tipped forward, watching the timberline with that calm attention he'd shown from the first day. I wanted to stay put all night, but chores don't pause for wonder. I went back to the barn, checked Mabel again, laid extra straw where she liked to bed, and ran my hand down her leg one more time to make sure heat wasn't building around the rubbed spot. She nuzzled my coat pocket looking for grain and snorted warm steam into my wrist. Ordinary. Solid. I held on to that. Around midnight, the weather turned mean. I woke to a crack, like a rifle shot, and found the yard silvered under freezing rain, every rail and branch glazed. The dead radio gave me nothing, but I could hear the power lines singing low beyond the lane, that tight wind-on-wire hum that sets your teeth on edge. By dawn, the house had gone dark and silent, except for the stove tick and the occasional thump of ice letting go from the roof. I pulled on wool and canvas, broke the skim on the stock tank, and moved slow because every board and stone had turned slick. The old oak stood out there, coated in glass, each furrow in its bark outlined white, and the flat stone looked like it had been dipped in clear paint. By the second day of that storm, the place felt less like a homestead and more like a machine running past red line. A section of barn roofing peeled back at the north corner with a grinding moan and left the aisle dusted in wet snow. Water found every low spot in the pasture and started cutting channels through mud that had been frozen hard 48 hours earlier. I stacked feed sacks against the draft, tied a tarp over the worst roof gap, and kept telling myself I had enough in me to hold the line alone. I told myself that because I had been saying versions of it for months. I told myself that because asking for help had started to feel like admitting I had failed at being the kind of man I thought I was supposed to be. Near dusk, the rain came sideways and heavy, and I heard Mabel bawl from the wrong direction, not the barn lot, lower pasture. I grabbed my coat and hit the porch at a run, nearly going down on the second step. She had slipped through the temporary panel I'd wired after the barbed wire mess and worked herself onto the slope where runoff was already sheeting toward the flooded swale. One bad slide down there and I'd spend the night in freezing water trying to bring her back, if I could. I shouted, waved my arms, and she turned her head toward me, confused and stubborn, ears pinned against the weather. My chest tightened so hard it felt like somebody had cinched a ratchet strap around my ribs. Then I saw him at the old oak. He was exactly where he had always stayed, on the wood side of that line, dark against the pale rain, big enough that the storm seemed to bend around him. He didn't charge in, didn't rush, didn't do anything that read like panic. He moved with purpose. He hauled a windfall limb from the timber, then another, dragging them to the low cut where water was pouring toward the barn lane. He set each one crosswise, braced with stones and root clumps, building a rough check line that slowed the runoff and turned the flow away from my track. Not neat. Effective. My father would have called it field engineering done by someone who understood ground. Mabel started edging downhill again, hooves skidding. I took 2 steps into the yard and stopped because I could see I'd never reach her in time on that ice. He had already shifted wide, circling on higher ground outside my fence, putting his body where she could see him without feeling trapped. No sudden moves, no noise. Just presence. She lifted her head, snorted, and turned away from that broad, dark shape, picking the uphill line back toward the gate she knew. He mirrored her drift from a distance, one pace at a time, and kept her angled toward safety until she hit firmer footing and clambered into the barn lot, sides heaving but upright and clear. Something gave way in me right then. Not quietly. I stumbled to the oak, put one hand on the trunk, and bent over like I couldn't get air. Rainwater ran off my hat brim and down my face, and for a second I told myself it was just rain. It wasn't. I started crying there in the freezing dark, the rough kind that makes your shoulders hitch and your throat hurt, all the held-back months coming through at once. I hadn't cried at the funeral, not really. I hadn't cried when I boxed Ellen's sweaters because the cedar chest smelled too much like her soap. I hadn't cried when Levi stopped answering every call. I had treated grief like a seized bolt I could break loose with enough leverage. Standing at that oak with floodwater hissing through grass and my cow safe because something out of the woods had cared enough to help, I ran out of leverage. "I'm sorry," I said, and I wasn't sure if I was speaking to Ellen, to Levi, to God, or to bark and rain. "I'm sorry." I shut down. I left him alone in it. I left everybody alone in it. I pressed my forehead to that old trunk and kept talking because once the words started, they would not stop. I thought if I kept moving, if I kept fixing things, I wouldn't have to feel it. I thought numb meant steady. I thought practical meant strong. It didn't. It just made me absent while I was still standing here. The rain softened to sleet, tiny pellets tapping my jacket and the oak bark. I wiped my face with a wet glove and laughed once through the tears, raw and embarrassed and relieved all at the same time. "Ellen, you'd hate this hat right now," I said. "You'd say I look like a damp fence post." On the far side of the trunk, I felt a faint vibration through the wood, a low pressure like another weight had come to rest there. I lifted my head and slid my hand around the oak just enough to see. His hand was on the opposite side of the same trunk, fingers spread against bark, massive and still. We were separated by that old tree's width. No crossing, no crowding, just contact through living wood older than both of us put together. He didn't look at me like I was broken. He looked at me like he was waiting while I put myself back together. I stood there with my palm on bark and his hand on the other side, and the storm noise seemed to step back a little. My breathing slowed. The shaking in my chest eased. I did not feel fixed, and I did not feel finished. I felt honest, which was new enough to count as a beginning. I pulled my phone from my coat with clumsy fingers and got Levi on the third ring. He answered over engine noise and said, "Dad, you okay?" "No," I said, and then steadier, I will be. Listen to me. I need you here, and I'm done pretending I don't." Silence. Wind over his line, a turn signal clicking. Then Levi said, "All right, I'll chain up and head out as soon as I can get clear of town. Keep your phone warm. Keep Mabel in." "I will." "You hurt?" "No." Another beat. "I'm coming anyway." When the call ended, I stood a moment longer and let that settle in. I had asked. He had answered. It was simple and hard and late, and still not too late. I looked back around the trunk. The space beyond the oak was empty now, except for sleet drifting through branches and the dark mouth of timber. No snap of limbs, no display, no last look held for effect. He was just gone, the way a good hand leaves a job site after the needed work is done. At the base of the stone sat one new marker. 2 river rocks crossed cleanly, rain shining on their surfaces. Beside them, half sheltered by the cedar I had left, lay a strip of peeled willow braided tighter than before, ends tucked and finished. I picked it up and slipped it into my coat pocket, not as proof for anyone else, just as something to carry that my hands had not made. I checked Mabel again, then spent the next hour with a shovel and rake opening a channel where he had started the diversion, following the line he'd shown me with those windfall braces. Water moved where it needed to go. The barn lane held. 3 hours later, headlights crawled up the drive through sleet and dark. Levi got out with chains over one shoulder and a red fuel can in his left hand. Hat pulled low, beard rimed white from road spray. For a second, we just looked at each other over the hood of his truck. 2 men with too much history and not enough practice. "You look terrible," he said. I barked out a laugh. Fair. He set the can down, stepped in, and hugged me hard enough to hurt, which was exactly right. "Show me what needs doing," he said into my coat collar. We worked by lantern light until the sky began to grey. He patched the panel I couldn't hold alone. I reset 2 stakes in the runoff line. We checked Mabel together and she leaned her head against Levi's chest. like no time had passed since he was a kid, carrying feed in a bucket too big for his arms. At first light, I walked him to the porch for coffee from the enamel pot, and he stopped at the edge of the yard, looking toward the old oak. Deep prints stood in the softened ground near the boundary, each one clear now where sleet had melted and set again. Levi stared, then looked at me, eyes wide but not mocking, not afraid. "You weren't kidding," he said quietly. "No," I said. "We didn't go closer. We didn't need to." The crossed stones remained on the flat rock, and the woods beyond the line were still and unhurried, as if the night had simply done what it came to do, and moved on. Levi kept staring at the prints until his coffee went cold in his hand. Dawn had come up the colour of wet steel, and the yard looked worked over, not wrecked. Water still moved in the channel we'd cut, but it stayed in the path we wanted. Mabel stood at the hay ring with her head down, chewing like she had signed a private treaty with the weather. Levi finally let out a slow breath. I don't even know what question to ask first. "Ask the one you can live with," I said. He looked at me then. Really looked. And I saw him taking stock the way mechanics do when they open a hood on a truck that's been running rough for too long. "Are you okay?" I leaned against the porch post and watched steam lift off the coffee cup. "I'm hurting," I said, "but I'm not shut down. That's different." He nodded once. His eyes were bright in a way he tried to hide. "You called me and asked. I've waited a long time for that." "I know." My throat tightened, but the words kept moving. "I thought if I kept things practical, I wouldn't drown. Ellen got sicker and I turned into a parts list. Then she was gone, and I stayed that way. You were grieving too, and I left you holding your half alone." Levi rubbed a hand over his beard and looked out toward the old oak. "I was mad at you," he said. "Still was some days, but mostly I missed you." That landed clean and hard. No accusation left to dodge. No excuse worth making. "I'm here now," I said, "if you'll let me be." He set his cup down on the rail and gave me that same quick, almost awkward hug from the night before, like he didn't trust himself with ceremony. "Then be here." After breakfast, we walked to the oak with a tape measure, my carpenter's square and Levi's phone beside mine. I photographed 3 clear prints with the square laid against the edge, then had Levi take one with my boot next to it for scale. He measured stride between 2 impressions and read the number out while I wrote it in the ledger margin. My hands stayed steady this time. When we finished, he crouched by the flat stone and touched the crossed river rocks without moving them. "You going to report this?" he asked. I considered the question longer than he expected. "No public report," I said. "I'm keeping the photos, measurements, and notes. If somebody asks honest, I'll answer honest. But I'm not bringing noise out here." Levi stood and scanned the timberline. "Yeah," he said softly, "noise would ruin it." That afternoon we dealt with what needed dealing with. We cut new panels for the weak section where Mabel had slipped through. We pulled the old tagged barbed wire coil down from the shed hook, carried it together to the scrap trailer, and wired it tight so no loose end could spring free again. I showed Levi the braided willow strip from my coat pocket, the tighter one left after the storm, and he turned it over in his palms like it might explain itself. "Feels fresh still," he said. "It does." He handed it back carefully. "Keep it somewhere dry." I set that braid in Ellen's old sewing tin, along with the first willow ring, and put both on the high pantry shelf. The river rock with the white vein stayed on the windowsill by the sink. The ledger, with all the dates and behaviour notes, went into the desk drawer in a manila envelope with printed copies of the photos. Not hidden, not displayed. Kept. 3 days passed before the co-op crews got power restored. By then, Levi had called Portman's shop from my mudroom and told them he needed another day. He stood by the wood stove while he talked, eyes on me, and when he hung up, he said, "I can come up every weekend till road's clear, if that works." "It works," I said. On the fourth morning, Milt came up the drive on his rattling four-wheeler with a sack of feed and a look that said he already knew enough. He killed the engine by the porch and took his cap off. "Heard lines are back," he said. "Came on last night." He shifted his gaze to the oak, then to Levi, then back to me. There was that same unfinished sentence in his face I'd seen months earlier by the mailbox. This time he finished it himself. "My granddad didn't just leave salt for manners," he said. "He left it because one winter his team got turned before thin ice on the creek. Said a big dark fella stayed on the far bank and paced till the horses chose the safer crossing. Grandad told me once, and never again. I figured he was spinning yarn till I saw tracks myself in '98 after the blizzard. Same line of timber, same distance kept." Levi looked at him hard. "You never told anybody." Milt gave a dry half-smile. "Told Roy enough. Folks either make fun of you or come hunting what ought not be hunted. Neither helps." He glanced at the flat stone. "You keep respect, it usually stays mutual." He stayed for coffee and left us a roll of woven wire. Before he went, he put 2 fingers on the porch rail and said to me, "That look you had all fall? Gone now. Keep it that way." Then he rattled off down the drive without waiting for an answer. By first thaw in March, Levi was up every Friday night with tools in the truck bed and groceries in a milk crate. We rebuilt the north fence proper post by post, but we left a wide, undisturbed arc around the old oak and the flat stone, rails ending short on both sides by silent agreement. One Saturday we were stretching wire when Jasper trotted to the stone and sat, tail sweeping the mud once, then twice. Levi followed his gaze to the trees and tipped his chin. "You see him?" he asked. "No," I said. "Me neither." He pulled the fencing pliers from his pocket and handed them over. "Still feels like company." It did. Birds moved normally. Deer crossed at dusk. When storms came, we'd sometimes find a fresh cross of stones on the rail by the low bend, usually before the worst weather hit. Once, after a heavy wind, a stack of dry cedar appeared at the line again, tied with red baling twine that never matched mine. We used it to start the stove and set back cracked corn and a pinch of salt in the thermos cap. No ceremony, just manners. In late April, Levi and I sat on the porch step after finishing a long day on the barn roof. The sky had that clear gold edge spring sometimes gives right before dark. He held Ellen's wedding band in his palm, the one from the nail by the sink, then passed it to me. "You keeping it there?" he asked. "For now." He nodded. "Mom would have liked this, not the roof leaks. This." He motioned toward the field, the repaired lane, the oak. "You talking again. Me being here." I rolled the ring between my thumb and finger and felt a grief that had changed from weight into shape, something I could carry without hiding from it. "She taught both of us patience," I said. "I was just slower learning." When the first hard cold returned in November, I was the one who called Levi before the forecast got ugly. "Chains on and come Friday if roads hold," I told him. "Already packed," he said. That evening I took my mug to the porch and stood where I had stood a year before, facing the old oak. The dead radio had been replaced by then, but I still left it off at dusk. Jasper, older and grey around the muzzle, walked to the boundary and lay down with his chin on his paws. The field went quiet in layers, not empty, listening. On the flat stone sat a single river rock, dark with rain, white vein bright through the middle like a narrow line of mourning. I smiled without meaning to, went down the steps, and set a small cedar bundle beside it from my own stack. When I straightened, I rested my hand on the oak bark and felt the rough grooves against my palm. Steady as a heartbeat, you notice only when you stop rushing. I still couldn't explain what I saw that winter, and I had quit trying to force it into a smaller frame than it deserved. I had evidence in a drawer, photos with scale marks, ledger entries, 2 willow braids in a sewing tin, and a son who no longer sounded far away on the phone. I had a neighbour who finally said the whole sentence. I had a lane that held in storms, a safe cow in the barn, and a place at my own table that did not feel like punishment anymore. The truth I carried was plain. He never came closer than the old oak. He never asked for anything but distance and respect. And when it mattered, he was there, so was I.